Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Allgeier, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 15 waiver wire targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. That's right, it's Week 15. The fantasy playoffs have begun for many of us. And the marathon, that is the fantasy season, is come to its final stretch of games. 3 weeks to determine who, in fact, is the best team in your leagues. And hopefully, we can help you capture a 2022 fantasy football championship. For those of you who play in a Week 18 championship, good luck. We'll be here, of course, putting out rankings videos, all that kind of jazz. But in the next 4 weeks, there's a lot of difficult decisions to be made, especially in regards to starting and sitting players going into their given matchups. Now, when we talk about progressing throughout weeks 15, 16, and 17, whether it's the team that you currently have and or the positions that you're going to be placed in, due to the fact that a lot of our fantasy prospects have been inconsistent as of late, and or the potential in which our fantasy prospects are getting injured, we want to go ahead and present prospects going into week 15 that we can pick up not only to give us value and help us win this upcoming weekend's matchups, but of course, give ourselves more fantasy depth as we continue for the entirety of the season in order to help us win a 2022 fantasy football championship. We'll be talking about prospects at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, kicker, and defensive positions going into week 15. And like I was mentioning earlier, there have been a lot of players over the course of the last month that have been extremely inconsistent. But in terms of the volume of injuries we witnessed just in week 14 alone is ridiculous. I'm just going to go ahead and just read off the list of injuries that have been made public in regards to offensive fantasy players. Guys like Jeff Wilson Jr., Russell Wilson, Deebo Samuel, Mike White, Tyler Huntley, Tyler Boyd, Kenny Pickett, Brock Purdy, Josh Jacobs, Richie James, Mike Boone, Dontrell Hilliard, T. Higgins, Dameon Pierce, Corey Davis, DJ Moore. A lot of fantasy prospects that have just only been made public. There's other guys that are dealing with injuries that we're not aware of. So we want to go ahead, have the strongest rosters possible by going ahead and addressing our positional needs, whether it is in regards to the primary fantasy positions. Now, before we begin today's video, again, a reminder, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Do yourself a solid, as we'll be making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season, all the way until the end of week 18 and even beyond into the NFL playoffs. So if you're in need of weekly rankings, whether it is running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, whether it's must-start players, whether it's trade decisions, whether it's just live streams throughout the week in order to help you set your lineups, prepare for some potential trades, and of course, set yourself up for success going into these upcoming weeks. Subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much. Also, if you guys haven't checked out PrizePicks, at the end of today's video, we'll be putting together a couple picks for tonight's Monday Night Football game between the Arizona Cardinals and, of course, New England Patriots. So we'll go ahead and put together a couple entries. Again, if you guys haven't checked them out, there's a link down in the description, and you can use promo code Andrew today when you sign up and make that first-time deposit to get that first-time deposit immediately doubled up to $100. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about Week 15 running back targets to begin with. Again, a reminder, as we talk about targets in terms of waiver wires, I always focus on players that have a wide spectrum of availability in terms of Yahoo format. So I do not talk about players that are rostered in more than 50% of leagues. So in regards to these available players, potentially, Zonovan Knight, Jerick McKinnon, Cam Akers, these are guys that we've mentioned over the course of the last month now ad nauseum. If in fact these players are available in your league, they should have already been on roster. Maybe some of you play in an 8-team league and you don't have much bench depth. Again, they've got to be picked up going forward. But for many of you, of course, these guys are already rostered. Therefore, we transition to talking about our number one going into the week at the running back position. And we only have 3 running backs on today's episode. It is Chuba Hubbard. He's currently rostered in only 33% of Yahoo formats. And I wanted to, of course, mention him because over the course of the last 2 games that he has participated in, he has had himself 17 and 14 rushing attempts. That is a high volume of rushing attempts. Yet he is still the number 2 overall running back in terms of rushing attempts for the Carolina Panthers, as D'Onta Foreman in the last 2 games has put up an incredible volume of overall rushing attempts. That being said, in the last 2 games, the Carolina Panthers have had 39 and 41 running back rushing attempts. Because of such a high volume of committing to the run, you can have 2 coexisting running backs in the form of a D'Onta Foreman and Chuba Hubbard. Of course, on Sunday, Chuba Hubbard had himself a great performance, putting up 17.4 half PPR fantasy points with a contribution of 14 attempts that led to 74 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 3 targets, 3 catches, and 25 receiving yards. Got himself, production on the ground, through the air, 17 total touches overall. An incredible week in my eyes, especially considering the fact that we knew that D'Onta Foreman was going to have himself a high volume of opportunity. Unfortunately, Foreman did not find the end zone, but of course, Chuba Hubbard and Blackshear, the other two running backs in this backfield, were able to take advantage of this incredible matchup against the Seahawks. And going into this upcoming week against the Pittsburgh Steelers, I think this is another opportunity for Chuba Hubbard to get himself 15 plus touches out of this backfield based on the volume of opportunity this team continues to give their running backs, and of course find potential success. Not only does it matter that he plays the Pittsburgh Steelers this week, but for the fantasy playoffs, takes on Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Tampa Bay. All matchups we could very easily see him succeed in. He's the number one running back waiver wire pickup going into the week. Moving on to our number 2, we have Tyler Allgeier. The primary reason I want to mention Tyler Allgeier is because there really isn't anybody left. He's currently rostered in 38% of leagues, and rightfully so. He should be rostered in that many leagues because, quite frankly, he gets a lot of running back rushing attempts. Over the course of the last 3 games, 10, 11, and 8, leading to 52, 54, and 55 rushing yards. And even though he's not able to accompany these performances with overall receiving work on a consistent basis and or rushing touchdowns, or touchdowns of any capacity, I believe that there may be a shift within this organization. Now that they are transitioning from Marcus Mariota to Desmond Ridder, there may be a conversation internally in which they're going to transition from Cordero Patterson, who over the course of the last 3 games from weeks 11 through 13 prior to the bye, 10, 11, and 11 rushing attempts for 52, 52, and 60. Very identical numbers as to what we have seen Tyler Allgeier put forth in terms of his contributions. There may be internal conversations from Arthur Smith, the head coach of this team, and the active play caller to go ahead and transition from Cordero Patterson to Tyler Allgeier for the remainder of the season, getting younger, giving these men experience, and of course, going forward with the mindset of using Cordero Patterson outside of the backfield, maybe as a slot receiving option, and of course, elsewhere, because we know he likes to get his special teams utilization. Either way, Tyler Allgeier could be a value going forward, especially if the transition is to occur within this offense. Moving on to the final option we wanted to mention at running back, it is Ogunbowale. The primary reason I want to mention him is because, of course, you need to go ahead and have handcuffs. This is going to be an overarching theme for the rest of the fantasy playoffs. Every time we talk about running backs, you got to make sure that you have blue chip running backs handcuffs. Now, in the case of Ogunbowale, he is not associated with a blue chip running back. Yes, his association with Dameon Pierce grants him value now that Dameon Pierce is potentially dealing with an ankle injury that could hold him out for time. But when we're talking about guys like Josh Jacobs, you need to have Zamir White. You have to have Joshua Kelly in relation to Austin Eckler. You got to have your handcuffs to these blue chip players. We know that Dontrell Hilliard's dealing with a neck injury going into this week. We still want to find whoever, Derrick Henry's potential backup is and have on roster. Now, this may not be an accessible point for all of you. Maybe you play in a league that does not have enough bench spots, or you play in a league where you are limited in the amount of running backs you can roster. If that's the case, then don't worry about handcuffs. But for those of you who are in need of handcuffs, be sure to address that, have them on roster. And in the case of Ogunbowale, who potentially could be the starting running back for the Houston Texans going into this upcoming weekend's matchups, we know over the course of the last couple years, regardless of what team he has been on, he's always been a successful receiving back and very easily could contribute in that factor going into this week if, in fact, Dameon Pierce is to miss. All right, let's go ahead and let's transition and begin talking about some wide receivers going into week 15. Beginning with our number 1, it is DJ Chark. DJ Chark had himself an incredible performance, and I do want to preface, yes, he's coming off of an 18-point week, back-to-back weeks of double-digit fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format, a great volume of overall targets, but the biggest issue that I have with DJ Chark going into this week primarily is the matchup he takes on the New York Jets. It is probably one that I don't want to potentially start DJ Chark in blindly, but I will say going forward for the remainder of the season, week 16, 17, he still will have value as the Detroit Lions are a rising team. They may be able to birth themselves a NFL playoff push with their efforts in the coming weeks here. And as long as this team continues to put forth great effort, DJ Chark will, of course, have himself fantasy value to be had for our fantasy teams. Moving on. Let's talk about Alec Pierce. Yes, he was on bye week last week, but we mentioned him even in week 13 in regards to this is a player that you might want to have on roster because once he comes back, he takes on the Minnesota Vikings, which is the literal best wide receiver matchup going into the week. This defense gave up touchdowns to not only DJ Chark, to Jameson Williams and Josh Reynolds, but they got torched by Jared Goff. And I absolutely believe that even with a bad Matt Ryan under center, there is a lot of potential to be had within this matchup, whether it is Alec Pierce and or potential, of Paris Campbell. We know that Michael Pittman Jr. is going to be perfectly fine, but Alec Pierce, based on his recent production and, of course, opportunities in terms of total targets, he's definitely an option that we want to go ahead and pick up going into this week. Moving on, let's talk about Elijah Moore. Of course, the injury to Corey Davis certainly allowed Elijah Moore to get himself a higher volume of targets. 10 targets for 6 catches and 60 yards on Sunday. And even though the weather, and even though Mike White's injury, which of course knocked him out for a play, he came back, got hit again, left, went and got an x-ray, came back into the game eventually. Then after the conclusion of the game, went to the hospital still was able to get the ball out of his hands and in the direction of his receivers, specifically Elijah Moore. Now, going forward, if in fact Corey Davis and his injury is going to be bothersome, if in fact we're going to transition from Mike White to Joe Flacco, we may be in a conversation here where Elijah Moore certainly can be of value with a current roster percentage of 27% going up against the Detroit Lions this upcoming weekend. Pretty good matchup on hand. Moving on, let's talk about more wide receivers. Other guys you may have forgotten. Let's talk about Mecole Hardman. Many of you have him on the injured reserve, but he's currently only rostered in 27% of Yahoo leagues, which leads me to believe that many of you dropped him off of the injured reserve. And now with the potential of him returning, we know that Kadarius Toney in his absence, Mecole Hardman's absence, was not able to take the job. And of course, we've seen guys like Jerick McKinnon try to fill in his stead. Of course, Jerick McKinnon coming off of a massive week of over 100 receiving yards and a boatload of catches. But with Mecole Hardman back in the lineup potentially going up against the Houston Texans, he certainly has upside. Let's not forget, in the last 4 games that Mecole Hardman played before his IR stint, he was averaging 16.15 half PPR fantasy points per game and had scored 5 touchdowns in the last 4 games. Overall, I think Mecole Hardman absolutely needs to be rostered, especially for the upcoming slate of games for the Kansas City Chiefs. Moving on, let's talk about Chris Moore, the wide receiver for the Houston Texans. Now, yesterday during our Sunday morning live stream, we had been given news that, in fact, the number 2 cornerback for the Dallas Cowboys at the time had gotten injured during pregame warmups, and that may have potentially, elevated more value to the receiving options for the Houston Texans, especially considering we expected it to be a negative game script for that team. It was a lot closer than expected, but either way, yesterday, many of you even asked about, should we play Chris Moore? And I know specifically there was one person that said, hey, this guy or Chris Moore, and Chris Moore was the best option available, and my goodness, did he ball out. 10 catches, 124, 17.4 fantasy points. And quite frankly, yes, this was a very special week considering Brandon Cooks was out, Nico Collins was out, and if Phillip Dorsett is getting covered by Trayvon Diggs, there's nowhere else to go with the ball besides your number 2 and 3 options, which in the case of the Houston Texans were Chris Moore and Amari Rodgers, both of them relevant fantasy plays. Going forward, Chris Moore could be a value with Davis Mills under center, but don't expect this level of success, especially considering the circumstance of Nico Collins and or Brandon Cooks returning to the lineup soon. Moving on, let's talk about Jahan Dotson, another player that we mentioned last week that is coming off of a big performance against the New York Giants in Week 13, where he had 5 catches, 54 yards, and a touchdown. In that game, he garnered the most targets that he had seen in quite some time, and because of that opportunity, it obviously led to success. We know that he is a talented wide receiver. He's demonstrated that already this season and early on. Now, hopefully going into this upcoming week where they take on the New York Giants once again, a secondary that, like I've mentioned over the course of the last 3 weeks now, is shorthanded without Adoree Jackson out there and some of their depth play in terms of secondary members. And because of this, we've most recently seen a slide from the New York Giants. I think they've lost, 4 in a row, and they've tied most recently against Washington. I believe the familiarity with the matchup and the opportunity on hand could lead to another big week here for Jahan Dotson. Moving on, let's talk about the New York Giants. In the case of Richie James Jr., currently he's on concussion protocol. Hopefully will be available this week. And the reason why I say hopefully is because he has scored a receiving touchdown in 3 of the last 4 games that he has participated in within this offense. Of course, that's why we mentioned him. Moving on, let's talk about another New York Giants wide receiver who certainly will be utilized going into this week is Isaiah Hodgins. At this current moment, he's coming off of consecutive fantasy point weeks of 12 or more fantasy points, scoring a touchdown in both those games in a half PPR scoring format. The touchdowns are aplenty for these receiving options, whether it's Richie James Jr. or Isaiah Hodgins. Both of them, once again, could be wide receiver 3 options within the given week. And if, in fact, we do see Richie James Jr. miss this week, Hodgins even gets more value in terms of his fantasy upside. Let's move on to our final options here. We have Ben Skowronek of the LA Rams. Like I mentioned last Thursday, I'm not 100% bought in on the receiving options just yet, but if we go ahead, give them some time, if they're going to sit on our bench, they could be a value. Again, we will also want to mention someone like Van Jefferson, who could end up building a rapport with Baker Mayfield in the upcoming weeks here. We know that Baker Mayfield and Los Angeles Rams, they take on pretty good secondaries here. This upcoming week, they have Green Bay on Monday night. And then the following week, they have the Denver Broncos secondary on Christmas Day. So it's going to be interesting, but could be a value. Moving on, let's talk about tight ends and quarterbacks, beginning with our top 3 tight end waiver wire targets for the week. Beginning with our number 1, Chigoziem Okonkwo. Again, Chigoziem has absolutely flourished into a rookie tight end that we can potentially trust for the remainder of the season. And yes, I want to preface that Austin Hooper is still getting a lot of value. In fact, Austin Hooper had himself 5 catches for 68 yards on Sunday. Yet, Chigoziem Okonkwo, 6 targets, 6 catches, 45 yards and a touchdown, 15.5 half PPR fantasy points. An incredible overall week for him. and going forward should be of value and should be picked up in many of our situations, whether or not you do have a primary starting tight end or whether you want to have depth for the remainder of the season, because we know how much matchups matter and finding the end zone certainly matters for the tight end position. And it seems like Ryan Tannehill is certainly leaning upon his tight ends for his overall passing success over the last couple weeks here. Let's not forget, in the last 3 games, Chigoziem Okonkwo has had himself 5, 5, and 6 total targets and has played 30 plus snaps in 3 out of the last 4 games that he has participated in. If opportunities continue to go up, I expect Chigoziem Okonkwo, 14% roster, to be a fantastic play going forward. Moving on to Tyler Conklin. He had himself 8 total targets. That does catch my eye. 5 catches, 28 receiving yards, not great. And sure, we still have, CJ Uzomah continuing to get targets and continue to play, 60+% of the offensive snaps, using a lot of, 12 personnel within this offense. I'm expecting Tyler Conklin to hopefully have value this week, and this is why I primarily say it. They take on the Detroit Lions. Over the course of the last couple weeks, the Detroit Lions have suffered in terms of stopping opposing tight ends. Hodgins and the rest of the Minnesota tight ends combined for 6 catches, 77. Jacksonville tight ends, 6 catches, 33 and a touchdown. Chicago tight ends, 4 catches, 74 and 2 touchdowns. Green Bay, 9 catches, 89. Miami, 338 and a touchdown. Dallas, 861 and a touchdown. The tight end position has succeeded against Detroit as of late. I expect Tyler Conklin to hopefully be of value this week. Moving on to our final option, we have Cade Otton. The primary reason why I mentioned Cade Otton is because the Cincinnati Bengals, they themselves, over the course of the last couple weeks, have certainly struggled. We're continuing to see Cade Otton play 60-ish% of the offensive snaps, even with an active Cameron Brate, but he's playing the wide majority of that. 60-40 is the normal split there. And if, in fact, Cade Otton continues to see a decent volume of targets, perhaps getting down to the red zone could be of value this week. Most recently, the Cincinnati Bengals versus tight ends. Of course, Cleveland tight ends combined for 8 catches, 67 and a touchdown on Sunday. The week prior, Kansas City, 6 catches, 77. Tennessee, 6 for 65. And we go the week prior to that, Pittsburgh tight ends, 10 catches, 87. A lot of potential on the board here if, in fact, Cade Otton can continue to get targets from Tom Brady. Moving on, let's talk about quarterbacks going into week 15, beginning with number 1, Brock Purdy. We want to preface that Brock Purdy is going to go ahead and get himself results in regards to his oblique injury that he sustained on Sunday. If, in fact, the MRI comes back positive or it isn't a serious injury, and they don't have to transition to playing Josh Johnson this upcoming Sunday, we're going to be in a great position because he's already gone ahead and demonstrated in the first 2 games in which he's participated that he could be a viable quarterback. In Shanahan's offenses, it doesn't matter who the quarterback is. It is a system that is built to help the quarterback find fantasy value. That's purely what it is. Get the ball out of their hands, get it into playmakers' hands. We know that Deebo Samuel is going to probably miss 4 to 5 weeks here with a high ankle sprain, if not something worse. And if we're going to continue to go forward without him, it's going to be difficult, but I still believe that Brock Purdy could be rostered and potentially started going forward if healthy. Moving on to Taylor Heinicke, the number 2 option we want to mention at quarterback. Coming off the bye week, Taylor Heinicke is only rostered in 11% of leagues. He's coming off a performance against the Giants in week 13 in which he had 275 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and 17.6 fantasy points. Again, throughout his career, Taylor Heinicke from 2021 through 2022 is undefeated against the New York Giants. He holds a 2-0-1 record. I know they most recently tied, but the Washington Commanders should have had that victory. Going into this upcoming week, I expect Taylor Heinicke to have himself a big performance up against the New York Giants once again. Moving on, let's talk about Ryan Tannehill, the final quarterback I wanted to mention. They do take on the Los Angeles Chargers, and hopefully we will have Treylon Burks back, which will continue to open up this offense. But the primary reason I want to mention Ryan Tannehill is because their defense sucks. They can stop the run. That is a given. But in the secondary, they have dealt with a lot of injuries, and they cannot stop anyone through the air. Trevor Lawrence went off. Obviously, due to the efforts of Evan Ingram and Zay Jones, they completely dominated that game. If, in fact, we could potentially see Justin Herbert with his slew of wide receivers go ahead and put up another big performance here, and if the Chargers mount a very early lead, it'll force Ryan Tannehill to have to pass the ball, and when he does, he will find fantasy value. All right, let's move on to the final section here where we talk about kickers and defenses going into week 15, beginning with our number 1, it is Cameron Dicker. Again, over the course of the last couple weeks, he's continued to be a stable fantasy kicking option. Currently rostered in 48% of leagues. Could be available. If he is, pick him up. Moving on to Michael Badgley. 2 consecutive weeks of double-digit fantasy points. I know that they take on the New York Jets. I think that continues to apply more potential for Badgley to be a utilized option within this offense as they're trying to kick the ball up between the uprights instead of scoring, because that defense certainly will play them tough. Moving on to the final option, and perhaps the one that is most widely available in your leagues, it is Joey Sly coming off of the bye week. In the last 4 consecutive games, Joey Sly's put up 19, 12, 8, and 9. He's currently rostered in 2% of leagues. If I'm trusting anybody, it could be him, assuming that the weather conditions aren't going to be rough between the game between the Commanders and the New York Giants. Let's move on to defenses. Arizona Cardinals are first and foremost because we do expect to see that Russell Wilson will potentially miss going into the week. If that's going to be the case, and even if Russell Wilson potentially even plays, there's still going to be value for the Cardinals defense up against the Denver Broncos, who certainly find themselves giving up a lot of points to opposing defenses. Moving on, let's talk about the Washington Commanders. They do take on the New York Giants. They took them on just a couple weeks ago. They hit the bye week. They've been preparing. And even in the last performance that they've taken them on, they put up a decent amount of fantasy points. Could be a value once again this week. Moving on to the Green Bay Packers. They take on Baker Mayfield and the Los Angeles Rams. I know that Baker Mayfield was coming off a short week, but they were playing against a defense that could not stop a soul. In some regards, the Green Bay Packers have been that this season. I think they're going to improve. And going off of the bye week, they're going to be in a far better position to prepare for Baker Mayfield and this Rams offense. All right, that's going to cover it in terms of waiver wire options. If you guys have any questions, be sure to let me know down in the comment section. I'll be sure to try to address them within the next 24 hours before waiver wires run. Outside of that, we're going to go ahead and transition to talking about some potential prize pick entries for tonight's games via the NFL between the Arizona Cardinals and, of course, New England Patriots. Let's go. All right, so as you can see to the right of me, we are here via PrizePicks. And again, the entire point of PrizePicks is picking more or less on given player statistics. Now, going into tonight's game, the fantasy prospects and potential entries that I feel most comfortable kind of tailing behind is in regards to receptions when we talk about Ramondre Stevenson and, of course, Greg Dortch. Ramondre Stevenson, his current number is 5 receptions, so he has to get himself potentially more or less. I'm expecting him to go more because in 4 out of the last 5 games, and of course, certainly as of late, he has been a primary receiving option for this team. With no Jakobi Meyers there, we're immediately going to expect that Ramondre Stevenson is going to be able to garner a high volume of targets and or receptions. Therefore, we go ahead and pick more on his current number. We're going to go ahead and put that in. Now, the other player that I wanted to talk about is Greg Dortch. 3 receptions is not enough. When there is no Rondale Moore within this offense, Greg Dortch has averaged certainly more than 3 receptions per game when he has been a starting option within the slot position of this roster. And yes, in those games, he didn't have an active Marquise Hollywood-Brown and DeAndre Hopkins. With so much focus on DeAndre Hopkins and Marquise Hollywood-Brown, Greg Dortch could very easily surpass this number. I'm expecting him to put together at least a 4 reception game here with Kyler Murray tonight. That is the 2 that I feel most comfortable with in terms of putting together a potential entry in tonight's PrizePicks. Again, if you guys are interested, you can go ahead and use promo code Andrew today. There's a link down in the description to sign up, make that first-time deposit, put together entries, whether it is the NFL, whether it's even perhaps the first half of the NFL games. We're talking about the NBA, of course, MMA, college football, college basketball, all of that kind of jazz. So check that out today. All right, that's going to cover for us. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Again, until tomorrow, we'll be talking about running back rankings. Be sure to subscribe, comment down below, click the like button if you like today's content. And until next time, guys, thank you, everybody, for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.